Good morning, boys. Today we're doing cartoon study, which is a part of visual literacy. Usually when we use the word literacy, we're referring to the ability to read and write. So being literate is about being able to use the fundamental building blocks of written language, so the letters and the words, in order to draw meaning and also convey meaning. And visual literacy is very similar. Of course, instead of using a written text, the text that we are going to be reading are predominantly visual. So it might be an advert or a comic strip or an infographic, but whatever the text, the skill is the same. We need to deconstruct it so that we can decode all the elements in order to better understand the meaning or the message that is being communicated to us. Now, you've studied cartoons for a few years now, and some of what we're going to be doing in this lesson is revising those skills. And we're starting off with speech bubbles. So you know that when a cartoonist wants to show that a character is thinking instead of speaking out loud, they're going to write their thoughts inside this little cloud bubble. Thoughts also can be written inside caption boxes. If you see a speech bubble that looks like this with these jagged, pointed edges, then you know that there's a loud sound or that a character is shouting. And the shape of that bubble makes sense. When we hear a loud sound or a high-pitched sound, we often describe it as being piercing or sharp. And it looks like those words have kind of exploded into the air. If you look at the lettering, it's also larger, it's in bold, there's an exclamation mark, and all of that is telling us that those words are being shouted. Here we have words that are being whispered. Shh, be very quiet. And the reason that I've included this is that often when answering questions about a cartoon in a test or an exam, boys will tell us that the capital letters are suggesting that a character is shouting, but that's simply not the case. Almost all text in comics and cartoons is written in capital letters for the simple reason that it's just easier to read. So even if a character is whispering, their words are going to be capital letters. If you want to look for a clue about the volume with which something is spoken, then you need to look at the size of the lettering. Compare the lettering to other words that are written in the cartoon. And if it's comparatively larger, then it's probably being shouted. So here we have a string of seemingly random and crazy symbols, and that is telling us that somebody is swearing or cursing. It's kind of a form of censorship. Here the cartoonist is using a combination of punctuation marks. So a question mark and an exclamation mark are usually used to show shock or disbelief. Boys, only cartoonists are allowed to use this. So if you're writing an essay, it's an academic exercise, and if you give me a whole row of exclamation marks, or if you give me one of these combinations, then you're probably going to be losing marks. Some cartoonists don't even use speech bubbles. In Madam and Eve, there's just a line between the words and the speaker. Other cartoonists use captions. One of the difficulties with using captions is that as the cartoon on the left is illustrating, sometimes it's difficult to know which of the characters is speaking. So the sound device that is most commonly used in all cartoons is onomatopoeia. Now, by now, boys, you should know onomatopoeia, that's words whose pronunciations imitate the sounds that they are describing. And you need to learn how to spell that word. So we've got on-o-mat-o, and it's this last little bit that usually trips you up, but there's a mnemonic to try and help you remember it, and it's on-o-mat-o, and then Prince of Egypt in Africa. Now, it's kind of interesting if you look at these illustrations. I have no doubt that all of them were created digitally, but it's interesting to see that the illustrators are sort of paying tribute to the earlier styles of comic books in the 1930s. Look at the fact that they've only used those 4 colors. There's red, there's blue, there's yellow and black. The colors that most of the superheroes were wearing, so Spider-Man or Captain America, they were always in those colors. And that's because of the way that comics were printed. Comics were meant to be cheap. They only cost 10 cents, and so they used the lowest grade paper. It was wood pulp paper, and they didn't have an array of different inks. They just used 4 colors, And if they wanted to create a different color, a secondary color, then they would layer them. And they also just didn't print solid ink. Instead, they used to print in these little dots. And they're called Ben Day dots after the gentleman who created them, Benjamin Day. So how it worked was, if you wanted to have a pinky color, then you would have all those little Ben Day dots, and they would be sort of spaced at regular intervals. If you needed a darker color, then you would use larger dots and you would run them into each other so that they created those lines. If I wanted to create green, then I would layer the yellow color over the blue color. But you can see the problem with this kind of 4-layered printing process with only those 4 colors is that often the different plates were misaligned. And so you have this sort of polka dot portion that is outside of the line art. You can see it there. And so in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, the producers really wanted the audience to feel as if they'd walked into a comic book. And so instead of, for example, the audience hearing the characters' voices spoken aloud in a voiceover, they used these little thought caption boxes, and you can see the lines and you can see the Ben Day dots. And here's another example of the artwork where you can see that those deliberately misaligned colors. Now, boys, none of that is examinable. I just thought it was interesting. So now let's get back to our cartoon study. You boys are actually really adept at interpreting and reading visual symbols. In fact, sometimes you think it's so obvious that when we ask you a question, you think it can't be that the teacher is looking for that because that's just too obvious. But you're really good at it. So for example, if you see something with a tongue sticking out and a little X over its eyes, you know that that means it's dead. You know that a light bulb over a character's head means that character is inspired or they have an idea. This little cloud with the fist coming out of it shows us that there's a fight. Anything with a skull and crossbones is telling us that there's danger, so we're assuming that this is a bottle of poison. And that's the Grim Reaper, symbolizing death. Here a character looks like he's been knocked out, he's kind of dizzy, and we can tell that because of the stars. He's seeing stars that are circling over his head, and of course the blue eye helps. This lady seems to be a little bit tipsy or dizzy, and we can tell that because there are these little symbols, they're called screens, which look like stars with the centers missing. And that's how cartoonists depict kind of that dizzy state. We know that a heart means love. So often in cartoons, we see these little droplets being used. And boys, they have a name, they're called ploods. But please don't use the name because nobody will know what you're talking about. I only discovered this name when I was preparing for this presentation. So it looks like sweat when you've got a character that's exercising, like in the bottom right, or the character looks like really, really hot. But also these little droplets are used just to show anxiety and nervousness. So if a character is stressed, then they're going to show a couple ploods around their face. Bad smells are shown with these little sort of wavy lines, and for some unknown reason, green is also used when there's a bad smell. Here a character is sleeping, and we know that because of the Zs. This is kind of a character's inner struggle. So we have a little angel on the one shoulder, and we have a devil on the other, and the angel is representing that character's conscience, right? That little voice that is telling us how we should be behaving. And then you've got the little devil that represents temptation. And so this character is kind of in a bit of a moral dilemma, trying to decide what to do. I've created this slide